In 2020, a team of geneticists led by Arun Durvasula and Shriram Sankaraman at UCLA published a study that should have made international headlines, but somehow slipped quietly into the scientific literature. They had discovered something unprecedented in the human genome: evidence of interbreeding between modern humans and an entirely unknown archaic human species that exists nowhere else on Earth except in the DNA of West African populations. This wasn't Neanderthal DNA. It wasn't Denisovan DNA. It was something else entirely: a ghost population that has left no fossils, no artifacts, no physical trace of its existence except for roughly 2 to 19% of the genome carried by people living in West Africa today. That represents hundreds of thousands of base pairs of ancient genetic code from a human species we never found, preserved only in living people. If you're interested in how genetic research is revealing lost chapters of human evolution that archaeology alone could never uncover, consider subscribing for future discoveries. The story of archaic human DNA in modern populations began in 2010 with the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. Geneticist Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute demonstrated that non-African populations carry approximately 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. Evidence of interbreeding that occurred when modern humans migrated out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations in Europe and the Middle East between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago. Then came the Denisovans, discovered through DNA extracted from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave. Denisovans represented another archaic human species that interbred with modern humans. Their genetic legacy is found primarily in Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, who carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. These discoveries established a new understanding of human evolution. We didn't simply replace archaic humans as we spread across the globe. We met them, coexisted with them, and interbred with them. Our genome is a mosaic predominantly modern human, but carrying fragments inherited from these ancient encounters. But there was an obvious gap in this story. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived in Asia and Oceania. Modern humans evolved in Africa and spent hundreds of thousands of years there before some populations migrated out. If interbreeding with archaic humans happened everywhere else, why wouldn't it have happened in Africa too? Africa was home to the greatest diversity of hominin species for millions of years. The problem was that no one had found evidence of it. Part of this reflected a research bias. Most ancient DNA studies focused on non-African populations, partly because DNA preservation is better in cooler climates. But it also reflected a methodological challenge. These statistical techniques used to detect archaic ancestry were designed to identify DNA that looked dramatically different from modern human DNA. They worked well for Neanderthals and Denisovans because those species had been separated from modern humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Detecting archaic ancestry within Africa was harder because any archaic African species would have diverged from modern humans more recently. The genetic signatures would be subtler, harder to distinguish from normal human variation. Durvasula and Sankaraman developed a new approach. Instead of looking for DNA that was obviously different, they used deep learning algorithms to analyze patterns of genetic variation across entire genomes. They trained their artificial intelligence system to recognize the statistical signatures of archaic introgression, the patterns left behind when archaic DNA enters a modern human population and gradually gets diluted and fragmented over thousands of generations. They applied this technique to genomic data from the Yoruba people of Nigeria and the Mende people of Sierra Leone, two West African populations with some of the most complete genomic datasets available. The algorithm scanned through millions of genetic variants, looking for segments of DNA that showed patterns inconsistent with purely modern human ancestry. The results were unambiguous. Both populations carried substantial amounts of DNA from an archaic human population. The algorithm estimated that approximately to 219% of the genetic ancestry in these West African populations came from interbreeding with an unknown archaic species. Even the conservative estimate of 2% represents a significant component of ancestry. Using molecular clock calculations techniques that estimate time based on the rate of genetic mutations, the team determined that this interbreeding occurred approximately 43,000 years ago. This was roughly contemporary with the interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals in Eurasia, suggesting that as modern human populations were expanding and encountering archaic humans across the Old World, similar interactions were happening within Africa. The genetic data revealed other crucial details about this ghost population. The archaic species had separated from the modern human lineage somewhere between 360,000 and 1 million years ago. This made them roughly as divergent from us as Neanderthals were. Though the wide time range reflects the difficulty of pinning down exact dates from genetic data alone, the amount of archaic DNA varied between individuals and between populations. Some West Africans carried substantially more archaic ancestry than others, suggesting the interbreeding wasn't uniform. It likely occurred in specific regions where modern and archaic populations overlapped, then spread through West Africa through subsequent population movements. Critically, this archaic ancestry is almost entirely absent outside of West Africa. Small amounts appear in African American populations, a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, but it's virtually undetectable in European, Asian, or other populations. This suggests a ghost population had a limited geographic range, probably restricted to West or Central Africa. And interbreeding occurred before modern humans began their major expansion out of Africa. So, who were these people? Without fossils, we're working almost entirely from genetic inference, but we can piece together some possibilities. Africa during the Middle Pleistocene was home to multiple hominin species. Homo heidelbergensis lived across Africa and Eurasia between 700,000 and 300,000 years ago, and is thought to be the common ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa, lived as recently as 236,000 years ago. The ghost population could represent a late surviving remnant of Homo heidelbergensis, or perhaps an unknown lineage that split from our ancestors sometime in the Middle Pleistocene and persisted in isolation till modern humans encountered them around 43,000 years ago. Without fossils, we can't definitively identify which species this represents. Some researchers have suggested the ghost population might be related to fossils we've already found but haven't recognized. The Iwo Aliru skull from Nigeria, dated to around 13,000 years ago, shows unusual archaic features despite its recent date. Some scientists have proposed it might represent a hybrid individual or a descendant of the ghost population, though this remains speculative. What makes this discovery particularly important is what it tells us about human evolution in Africa. For decades, the narrative has been relatively simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa. Then some populations migrated out and encountered archaic humans like Neanderthals. But the ghost population evidence suggests African human evolution was far more complex. Rather than a single population gradually evolving into modern humans, Africa likely hosted multiple hominin populations that were partially isolated from each other across the continent's vast geography. These populations occasionally encountered each other, exchanged genes, then separated again. Modern humans emerged from this complex process of population structure, isolation, and periodic mixing. This fits with other recent genetic evidence. A 2017 study by Eleanor Scarry and colleagues argued that modern human origins involved multiple African populations that were weakly connected across the continent, with different modern human traits appearing in different places at different times before eventually coming together. The discovery raises profound questions about how many ghost populations might exist in the human genome. If West Africans carry DNA from an unknown archaic species, what about other African populations? The genetic diversity within Africa is greater than the genetic diversity of the entire rest of the world combined. This suggests Africa's evolutionary history was correspondingly complex, likely involving multiple archaic lineages we haven't yet detected. Recent studies have found hints of additional ghost populations. A 2019 study identified possible archaic ancestry in Central African hunter-gatherer populations. A 2023 study found statistical evidence of archaic introgression in East Africa. Each of these potential ghost populations would represent separate interbreeding events with different archaic species. The challenge is that detecting these ghosts requires both sophisticated analytical techniques and high-quality genomic data from diverse African populations. Much of the human genome sequencing effort has historically focused on non-African populations, creating an enormous gap in our knowledge. As more African populations are sequenced and as analytical methods improve, we'll likely discover additional ghost populations that have been hiding in plain sight. What we're relearning is that the human family tree is untactually a Trieste-braided river, with multiple channels that split apart, flow separately, then crash back together, mixing and remixing. Every time human populations encountered each other, whether in Africa, Europe, Asia, or Oceania, genetic exchange was possible. And it happened repeatedly throughout our evolutionary history. The West African ghost population is particularly significant because it demonstrates that this pattern of interbreeding was unlimited to the encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals or Denisovans that occurred after the out of Africa migration. It was happening within Africa too, probably multiple times with multiple archaic populations, shaping the genetic makeup of modern humans before we ever left the continent. These ghost populations have left no cities, no writings, no tools we can definitively attribute to them. We don't know what they looked like or what their cultures were like, but they're not extinct. They live on in the DNA of millions of West Africans today, carried forward across thousands of generations. And the only reason we know about them at all is because their DNA survived in the people whose ancestors met them 43,000 years ago and carried their genetic legacy forward into the present.